Hi, it's Mark Fulcher here, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this 11:11 talk. It's my pleasure to be joined today by Dr. Celeste Geertsema. Celeste is a sport and exercise physician at the Aspetar Qatar Orthopedic and Sports Medicine Hospital. Celeste was the first female team physician to accompany a male football team to the World Cup, and has also been the first female to be a FIFA venue medical officer at the World Cup. So it's my pleasure to introduce Celeste. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
So Celeste, today you're going to talk a little bit about the differences between men's and women's football and some of the reasons why those may be.
Indeed.
So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. I want to tell you the story of a young footballer that grew up in poverty in the back streets of Brazil. This player could dribble better, shoot harder, and think quicker than any of the boys on the team. The nickname given to this player was Pele, in a skirt. You see, this player was a girl, and that unfortunately made all the difference. Her real name is Marta, and she eventually became one of the best female footballers of all time. She was crowned the FIFA Women's World Player of the Year 5 times in a row between 2006 and 2010, and she's been in the top 3 on 6 other occasions. She's played alongside Neymar and even inspired fans to replace the name on his number 10 jersey with hers because they couldn't find one with her name on it. You would think that being the best in the world at what you do would give you a chance of being treated like an equal in your profession. And if Marta was a tennis player or a track and field athlete, she may well have had a shot at equality. But unfortunately, by choosing football, Marta entered what is possibly the most unequal profession in the world. The numbers speak for themselves. A global sports salary survey performed in 2017 looked at the combined pay of all the players in the top 7 women's football leagues in the world and compared it to the salaries of the top men's leagues. It turns out that the world's best 1,693 women footballers combined earns as much as a single male footballer, Neymar, who also happened to play at the same club as Marta, where the women's team was discontinued in order to afford his salary for a further 2 years. The same survey looked at the gender pay gap in the English Premier League, and it revealed that the best professional women's footballers in England earn 1% of their male counterparts. The same occurs in the United States, where the US national women's team won the FIFA Women's World Cup in 2015 and generated more revenue and profit than their male counterparts. Yet, their prize money for winning the World Cup was a quarter what the men's team received, even though the men were eliminated in the second round. It was only 6% of what the men's winners earned for winning the World Cup. So $2 million versus $35 million. Why this difference? The typical reason given for this is that women are different. Well, of course, women are different, aren't they? I mean, just look around you. It's difficult to pick the woman in the crowd. But is being different enough reason for this inequality? After all, you can pick the ethnically different players in a team easily too, and yet they are treated as equals, aren't they? So simply being genetically different is not a good enough reason for this inequality. For me, the only logical reason would be that women are much, much worse footballers than men, and therefore don't deserve the same treatment. Maybe 100 times worse. And from a physiological point of view, there is some truth in this concept. Football is a sport where speed is highly desirable, and women's speed records from the 100-meter through all the disciplines to the marathon are consistently 10% slower than men. And you know, speed is a biological phenomenon which is unlikely to change in the near future. But that's not all. Women also have less endurance, agility, strength, and power than men. Can this be changed? Perhaps some of it can, because some of the reasons for this may be rooted in history. This slide reveals some interesting facts about the history of football. The first is that football was banned in the 14th century in England because it was just too rough. There were only 2 rules: no manslaughter and no murder. But after the introduction of some rudimentary rules of the game, it was eventually legalized in 1605, and both men and women played, even though it was still quite a rough sport. In 1863, the FA was founded, and the first officially recorded game between women was in 1892 in Scotland. By 1908, it was an Olympic sport, but only for men. Remember, the first female athletes were only allowed access to the Olympics in 1900. By 1920, just after the outbreak of the First World War, women who were working in the munitions factories were playing regular, extremely well-attended games, with one match attracting a crowd of 53,000 spectators. However, by 1921, the FA had banned women from playing, citing that the game of football was highly unsuitable for the female body. In the meantime, the first FIFA World Cup was played in 1930, but only for men. And it wasn't until 1971 that the FA eventually lifted the ban on women playing football. In the end, it wasn't until 1991 that the first Women's World Cup was played, in 1996 that women's football eventually made it to the Olympic Games. So as you can see, the men's game was able to progress for 50 years when there was very little development in the women's game. We can still see this effect today, with boys starting to play football at a much earlier age and entering well-established academies where they can learn how to play and develop aerobic fitness, as well as all the other skills required in football. So maybe, with enough time and opportunities for young girls to start playing at an early age, women will become fitter, more agile, and tactically better. But here's the thing. I think we are making a fundamental mistake waiting for women to become men on the football pitch. Why are we not appreciating the differences between the men and the women's game? The way we can, for example, appreciate the differences between male and female tennis players. In tennis, we don't expect Serena Williams to play like Roger Federer or the other way around. We appreciate both for the unique elements they bring to the game. So why not the same for football? Remember, football is not only about speed and fitness. It's the beautiful game. And the beauty of football is that it cannot be played by a single player. It's the ultimate team sport. And women are really good at team sport. This is what Tom Sermani, ex-coach of the US and Australian women's teams, say. Women are more team-orientated while male players are primarily concerned about their own performances. The women's game also offers other differences. Some coaches, such as Hope Powell, who coached England national women's team, believe that the slower pace of the women's game may contribute to a more tactical and skillful game. And of course, many believe that women play a more honest game by simulating less than men. Well, this has actually been confirmed in a study by Rosenbaum in 2011. Women are nearly twice as likely as men to have a real injury when they go down in a game. The reason it's important for us in sports medicine to recognize the differences between the men's and the women's game is that the injury patterns are different. Research has shown that women footballers are far less likely to suffer a hamstring injury, syndesmosis injury, or groin injury than men. But they are 2 to 3 times as likely to suffer from ACL injury. And when they sustain concussion, it tends to be worse than if they were a man. It's already clear from our very limited studies that extrapolating findings in male footballer studies to female footballers is about as unscientific as it gets. And yet, research in women's football is still woefully inadequate. One of the reasons given for this is that there is no money for this kind of research in football. No money in football? In 2017, the English Premier League declared £4.5 billion in revenue and £500 million in profit. I think the real answer is that there's no money for this group. And one of the reasons for this is that in sports medicine, women are almost always classified under the special groups category, together with disabled athletes, children, and the elderly. I would like to suggest that we consider changing women's traditional classification from a special group to a different but mainstream group. Here are a few facts to consider in favor of this change. For a start, women make up 49.5% of the world's population. Ironically, the birth rate is actually 50%, but the 0.5% difference is caused by female infanticide in countries where female babies have less opportunities in life and are therefore not desirable. Even though women clearly do not make up 50% of all footballers today, we should bear in mind that women's football is arguably 50 years behind men's football in development and participation. Therefore, we shouldn't be looking at what's happening today. We should be looking at what may be happening tomorrow. The answer is in the youth. And things in women's football are changing fast, especially in the past 2 to 3 years. This can be seen in the big organizations such as FIFA, the English FA, and US Soccer. FIFA underwent a restructuring in 2016 and developed the FIFA Forward program, which has completely changed the way funding is structured. Some of the key objectives in the women's program are to first increase the number of women players, secondly increase the quality of the women's game, and thirdly increase the opportunities for all women on and off the pitch. And member associations' funding depends on prioritizing these goals. It was revealed by the Football Association in England last year that 25% of all registered players in the country are female, and a third of that group are younger than 16. The FA has published their game plan for growth in March 2017. One of their goals is quite straightforward. They want to double the number of women and girls playing football by 2020. One way of achieving this is by developing the Wildcats program, which creates opportunities for girls between the ages of 5 and 11 in 200 clubs to play football from a young age. In 10 to 15 years' time, young footballers from this program will be mature players with more experience than most of the adult women playing in the world today. Ironically, one of the 8 strategic priorities is to achieve a shift in culture by breaking the barriers to participating and following women's football, indicating a desire to close the gap created 100 years ago. In 2016, US Soccer also launched their first development academy specifically for girls, with 53 clubs joining in the first year, covering all age groups. However, even though professional organizations are now embracing the women's game, one of the key factors in the success of the women's game is commercial opportunities. It doesn't matter how much money FIFA, the FA, or the USA are putting into women's football. If there's no fan base or advertising money in it, it will not be enough. But here is where the women's football shows the most promise. The Women's World Cup in Canada 2015 brought almost $500 million in economic activity for Canada, 46% more than was originally predicted. There were almost 1.5 million fans attending the matches, and this represents the biggest attendance at any FIFA tournament outside the Men's World Cup to date. The TV audiences were even more impressive. More than 25 million people watched the final of the Women's World Cup, which made it the most watched soccer match in US history. And this included all the men's games, even in the FIFA World Cup. The global TV audience for the Women's World Cup was 750 million. In the UEFA Champions League final, 4 million English fans watched their team play against the Netherlands in the semi-finals, the highest audience figures for BBC Channel 4 to date that year. In the same competition, 7 million German fans watched their team beat Russia in the group stages, a quarter of the entire TV audience for that night. Women's football. Similar commercial changes have been seen in England, with the FA Cup attracting a record-breaking 45,000 fans at Wembley Stadium, which was an increase of 30% more supporters than in the previous year. And now, for the first time, sponsorship of the men's and women's teams have been separated, which has traditionally been a winning formula in creating commercial viability in a particular sport. So the fan base is growing, and the commercial companies are starting to notice. Nike is arguably the biggest sponsor of women's football, and they realized the commercial potential already earlier in 2015 by launching their series of the United States national women's team jerseys, but in men's sizes. Similarly, the most successful sports video franchise of all, the FIFA game, in 2015 released their FIFA 16 game with women's teams for the first time. And then, of course, following these recent changes in commercial viability of women's football and based on the demand for gender equality, some of the most egalitarian football associations in the world have taken the initiative to address the huge pay gap in football we've discussed. So in December 2017, the Norwegian Football Association announced equal pay for their male and female football teams, with the men even agreeing to a wage cut in order to ensure equal pay for their female counterparts. And 1 month ago, the New Zealand Football Association became the first association in the world not only to offer equal pay, but also equal prize money and travel conditions for all their national team players, irrespective of whether they are men or women. We cannot accurately predict the future of football, but judging by the changes we've started to see in the past 2 to 3 years, I do believe that in 10 to 15 years' time, a much larger percentage of our football population will be women. And if we want to remain at the cutting edge of football medicine, we need to start acknowledging the differences in men's and women's football and men's and women's football injuries. This also means we need to be doing the research in this group now. And when we as a society can move past mere acknowledgement to actually celebrating the differences between the men's and the women's game, then maybe, just maybe, one day when your child grows up to be the next Pele in a skirt, you will never have to think, if only she was a boy.
Thanks, Celeste, for what is, I'm sure, going to be a much discussed talk and a much debated topic. It's fascinating.
Thank you very much, Mark. I know it's a bit certainly controversial topic, and people will have many opinions about it. I'm looking forward to the questions.
Yeah, look, I think one of the great things that might come out of this is some discussion, and I'd just like to direct listeners to the network where there is a recently formed women in football group, and that may be an interesting place for users to go and discuss some of these issues after listening to the talk. So perhaps that may be something that you'd like to check out. As you alluded to, Celeste, you're not quite off the hook yet. We've got a few questions that have come in from the network. So just a reminder to listeners that if you do want to interact with our experts, there is an opportunity to go to the network and post questions in the 11 and 11 discussion group. And so we've got a few questions for Celeste today. So I think we'll get into those, Celeste.
Sure, go for it.
The first question I think is a fascinating one. So the observation has been that there's less simulation in women's football. Do you think that that will change as the game gets faster?
It's an interesting question, and of course, we don't know what the future will bring. But I do believe that the women's game, even though I personally don't think we should see women becoming men on the football pitch, it certainly is becoming faster and more tactical and more skillful. And we know that one of the tactics that men employ in football is to fake an injury. And so, unfortunately, I think as we move towards that, probably we will see more simulation injuries in women. Although it's also possible that with the introduction of the VAR, that may be curbed somewhat, not only in the women's game, but also in the men's game.
Yeah, so just the VAR, just for those that haven't heard of that term before, is the video assisted refereeing technique we're seeing at the World Cup.
Yes.
The next question is another interesting one. You alluded to the fact that there's not much research out there in women's football. Where do you think we should start? So where should we direct our energy in researching women's football?
Well, I think the logical answer for me would be that we should start with epidemiology studies. We already know that there are certain areas where women are more or less likely to get injuries, and more likely the ACL injuries and concussion. And there's already some research into those areas. But to be honest, we don't really know exactly what the differences are between men and women because we don't have the same epidemiological studies. So my suggestion would be that we should start from the beginning, get an idea of what are the differences in injury profile, and parallel some of the epidemiology studies that have been done in men already. I know that the UEFA group just last year set up the first women's epidemiological study. So that's a great start. And I think it's now time to expand that into the rest of the world.
Yeah, we don't know if we're winning if we don't have a baseline, do we?
Exactly.
No. Final question is, how do we increase the interest in women's football?
That's a wonderful question. You know, when you talk to people about men and women's football, one of the first things they always say is, well, you know, women's football is just not that interesting. There aren't that many people interested in it. And of course, then the logical argument after that is, well, if people are not interested in watching it, then why should we put money into it? Ironically, and I'm not a marketing specialist, but from speaking to people and from what I've read, this is the wrong approach. In the era that we live in now, the interest follows the money, not the other way around. So if you do not have networks that are showing women's football on TV, people don't watch it because a lot of people, the biggest audience for football is actually not on the pitch, it's on the sideline, it's actually on the TV. So if the TV channels are not showing something, people won't be watching it. So you have to put the money into the sport first and push the sport that way, and then you get the following. And in fact, this is exactly what the English FA has done now by separating the men's and the women's funding so that the women's team have their own sponsor. And that sponsor is now going to push women's football independent of what's happening in the men's game. So I think that's the first place to look. And I'm really happy to see that there are signs of that happening all over the world. And now that the FIFA World Cup is going to be in the US in future, even though it's the men's World Cup, we're very much aware of the fact that the women's team is far more popular in the US than the men's team. So I suspect that in itself will be a boost for women's football. And then, of course, the second area is the grassroots level. And football is, in fact, the highest participation sport in many, many, many countries for young kids. And if we can increase that and if we can push that, especially if we can create role models for these kids, then they will grow up as real football fans, and especially for the girls. And this is where the FA is, the English Football Association is doing the right thing by creating these academies for young girls and getting them into football at age 5. You know, if you can start being interested at age 5 and you become a really good footballer by the age of 15, 16, 17, you know, that's invariably going to increase the interest in the women's game.
Look, Dr. Celeste Geertsema, thank you very much for your time and for sharing your expertise with us. I look forward to some questions on the network and some healthy debate.
Thank you very much. So am I.